Good evening. You've reached the dark side of the mountain. Welcome to South Side Paranormal with your host, DJ Nemo, bringing you top tier investigations. We look at things through history, through time. We look at mysterious hauntings, mysterious creatures, and things that go bump in the night. So strap yourselves in, open up your minds, and question everything. Good evening. You are tuned into Southside Paranormal with your host, DJ Nemo. That's me. If this is your first time enjoying this podcast, welcome. We are happy that you're here and we hope that you learn lots, and we thank you for your love and your support. Tonight's episode is episode 6, which is actually the second part of our Mexican folklore series that we are doing. We decided to break Mexico down into 3 different parts. I know people have been emailing me and telling me, oh, there's so much more. There absolutely is so much more. We might have to do a sequel to this 3-part series in the second season. But if you haven't heard part 1 of the Mexico podcast, La Llorona, that was last week's. Please tune in, like, share, and subscribe. Tonight's episode, we are focusing on a very specific topic, but it seems to plague a lot of Latin American, not just Mexican, Latin American, even in Asia, basically any country that was a former territory of the Spanish Empire. And what we're talking about this evening is Los Duendes. Los Duendes, if you're not familiar with the term Los Duendes, we're talking about little people, okay? Now, there's different takes on it, and essentially what we're talking about is like a gnome type creature, okay? Now, there's different interpretations of it depending on what country or area you are from. The Central American duende is very different from the one in Mexico. The Mexico one is completely different than the Philippines. And we'll talk about all the 3 different theories of what these entities are. Some are friendly, some are very not friendly. And we're actually going to share one of the most famous documented cases of one of these creatures. And we'll talk about what the theory is. Is it a duende? Or is it something else, something even more unique and rare? But this is an actual documented sighting of one of these creatures that has not only been featured on many episodes on TV shows. Monsters and Mysteries is one of the most famous ones. I saw this episode pop in, but I knew about it from just for local folklore and reading about this one particular case in California. But we'll get to that. That'll be the 3rd story of this evening. So let's begin with this Los Duendes. Now, as I said before, they're kind of like little people. Now, there's different sizes of these creatures, but basically, some report them as like little human-looking things that are maybe a foot tall. Some reports as high as 3 feet, but they're not bigger than that. Okay. Some are smaller, some are bigger. But where does Los Duendes come from? So we'll start with the Central America one, because a lot of people is Central America. So this is the countries of like Belize, Panama, Guatemala. Okay, the Los Duendes concept is very firmly entrenched in them. And they talk about these Los Duendes, little people. Basically, they're forest people, unlike the Mexico and the Philippine versions, which are a little bit different. but they believed that these little people live in the forest, in the jungle areas. And basically their goal was, if you got lost out there, they would try to help you find your way back to the village. Now these Los Duendes they consider them in Central America more like a forest spirit. Okay. But they're not necessarily a bad thing. They're seen more as a good thing. And there are different versions of it. Like, for example, a lot of the African Creole, Caribbean type people, in Belize, Guyana, they refer to it as like the Tata Duende, and like Tata's like your grandpa. Okay. But what's different is that what they have 4 fingers, unlike how we have 5. Basically, they have 4 fingers, but they're missing like a thumb. And so they all throughout this like Central America region. And basically they're guardians of the forest. And so they're very helpful, but they're very shy. They don't normally reveal themselves because they're very fearful of humans. However, it has been documented in Los Duendes, the Central American ones, that if you attack one of these creatures, they are extremely vengeful, and they will basically go through all sorts of things to ruin your life, using all sorts of different things, tricks, and all sorts of crazy stuff like that. But that's what they think about these Los Duendes, like the little people. Okay. Now, they're seen as a more of a forest guardian of the spirit of, well, maybe they're a fairy type creature, a fairy type entity. We're not really sure. But I said, overall, they're pretty good, considered good. And unless you mess with them, and you mess with them, they're very vengeful. Now, back to Mexico. In Mexico folklore, these Los Duendes are like gnome little creatures that live inside the wall of a house, especially if you have like young children. And they say they only really appear to kids. Why? Because they said that when you're younger, your veil's not pierced, like you're not aware of the world and the surroundings, and so you're very open to things. That's why oftentimes you'll see people saying, oh, if you're a toddler, the toddler saw, my grandma, and she described my grandma, even though my grandma's been dead for 20 years. But my grandma, the way she dressed or the way she spoke, that was a very specific way, and my toddler told me. Is because they're open to that kind of thing. They're open to those kind of things. And so the people in Mexico believe that these Los Duendes, these little gnome creatures, live inside the house, and they live in the walls. Okay. And there's different depending on where you're at in Mexico. It just depends on what people think about them. And I said before, these ones are ones that, like, you don't want to necessarily mess with them. They're mischievous. I don't want to say that they're evil, but they're more mischievous. Like, they like to play pranks on people. Okay, they think it's funny. Like, they're like, oh, well, let's go move this chair over here, or let's mess with this person and hide your toothbrush in the hallway. That kind of thing. They're mischievous. And when you start messing with them back, then they can turn very vindictive. There are reports of these duendes actually killing people in Mexico, especially like in the Oaxaca region, Zapotec, and some of these regions in Mexico. But basically, they can be very vengeful. So, like, they consider themselves mischievous, and some people think mischievous is be bad, but some of them are kind of playful. But the thing is, if you start trying to mess with some of the ones, they can become extremely vengeful, to the point where they're out there to ruin your life. And in some situations, based on the folklore, that they've actually killed people. Now, what these little duendes are, some people think gnomes, some people think some kind of creature, like an entity, a spirit entity, like a fairy. Some people also think that these duendes just always existed. They existed way back in the time, like they existed in the Aztecs time. And we talked into to several in-depth theories about, the Aztecs and like La Llorona and how the fall of the empire. But some people think that these creatures, have always existed in Mexico. They were like the ancient times. They've always existed, just kind of existing with humanity. And over time, they've adapted to what they are now. And again, it's very different compared to the Central American duendes, which are, they're forest people. If you get lost, they're trying to help you. They're more friendly compared to the Mexico version, which they are more mischievous. And if you mess with them, they can actually ruin your life. There's been documented cases in Mexican folklore of them killing pets, cats, dogs, leaving it there for you to find it with small wounds. And sometimes people have reported some of these duendes with weapons, like a small little dagger or a knife. People have seen that in Mexico. So that's kind of like the Mexico one. And then we're going to get to the next one, which is the Philippines. Now, why we talk about the Philippines when we're talking about Mexican folklore? Because the Philippines also have, just like Mexico, a deep Spanish connected culture, because you have to remember Mexico and the Philippines were both colonized by Spain. And while the Philippines is in Asia, it's over there by Japan. They have a very unique culture. And I could speak from that, being half Filipino myself, that they have a very unique culture. It's kind of like a weird blend of a lot of native Pacific Islander type and things, but then also mixing with the Catholic aspect that was brought over by the Spanish. Now, the duendes that are in the Philippines are a little bit different. Okay, they're a little bit different, and you see them more in the mountain regions of the Philippines. We oftentimes refer to them as the old man. Nunong sa bunso. That's like, it's the Tagalog, which is the Philippine language, of like the old man of the mount. Unlike the Mexico one, where they live specifically in your house as like a guardian kind of thing. They like stay in the house, and you kind of again, they're mischievous. The ones in the Philippines don't necessarily live in your house. They actually live in the forest. It's kind of like a blend of the Central America one. And they live in these giant termite mounds. And if you've seen some of these, how the termite mounds are in Asia and like Africa, they're huge. I mean, they're like 6 feet tall, 3 to 5 feet tall in some regions. Just depends on the area. But these termite mounds, they're if you talk Eddie Filipino, and they see that, I've seen these mounds actually in the northern region of the Philippines, in the town called Baguio. I've seen these mounds, and my cousin's like, "Oh, don't go near them. Don't go near them," because basically, the way the duendes in the Philippines are characterized, it's a good or evil. There's no like it's mischievous, or in like Mexico where they're kind of playful, but if you mess with them, no. In the Philippines, it's a distinct feature of good versus evil. Okay, and the way you can tell is by their outfits. Okay, and then like also to their skin color. If they're wearing white, like a white hat, kind of like a gnome, they tend to be good. And they often would see as playing with children, because again, it goes back to this theory of kids can see them, adults cannot. But if you see one that has dark clothing or a black hat on them, those are the ones that you want to avoid according to Filipino culture. And if you make one mad, you're going to be cursed. And not only because these things are more than likely immortal, based on the research that I've done. If like what I mean by immortal, like they live for like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And so if you offend one, and they will bring a curse upon you and your whole family. And basically, they'll wreck your whole family's life. They'll bring pain, calamity, spells, all sorts of things. They'll follow you back, and they'll just wreck your life. It doesn't matter where you move. They will track you down. They will put a spell on you and future generations if you make one mad. Now, how do you fix that? I have absolutely no idea. Nor do I want to find out, I wish I had more research on how, like, if you do offend one of these things, how do you make things right? Oftentimes, based on other folklore and legends I've researched, you oftentimes have to make an offering of peace to one of these creatures. Now, that's not necessarily a duende, but that's just in creatures in general, that you make a sign of peace, like, hey, we're friends, we're cool, and hope that they squash it, because if they don't squash it, if they're basically immortal, where they're living 400 or 500 years, I mean, how many generations of that is that for your family that you're just out there wrecking your life? And now I've seen these termite mounds, and my cousins are super paranoid. Like, I wanted to get really close to take a picture, and they were like, "Oh, cousin, don't go over there. That's where those gnomes live, the duendes." And they were very paranoid about that. And I'm like, well, I didn't know about all this information now that I didn't back then that I do now. But it was interesting to know that they take it with deep-seated, like, seriousness over there. Because again, if you offend the one that is black, they're gonna wreck your life. Basically, that's what it is. And it's just interesting to see. While in Mexico, it's more seen like a Harry Potter. I know a lot of my listeners are familiar with Harry Potter, and it's like, Dobby, they gave Dobby a sock. He's a free elf. It's like that kind of thing. It's like a house thing. It's like it's a guardian of the house. While in Mexico, or in the Philippines, it's more oh, don't mess with it, and it'll wreck your life for future generations if you make it mad. So those are the kind of the three different theories that we know of Los Duendes. Now, there might be different variations of any of one of those topics I've just talked about, but that's what the overall research says. Now, what about the United States? Well, that brings us to the case in California. Now, this is a very famous case out of Porterville. Now, if you don't know where Porterville is, it's kind of in the mid-central part of California. And then near Porterville is this place called the Tula River. And there was an incident with this lady named Tammy. I don't know if I have her last name, but it is a document. You can look her up and just put Tammy Gnomes, okay, and California, and then you'll be able to see her story. But basically, this is one of the most famous documented stories of someone actually having an encounter with one of these gnome type creatures. Now, in California, these gnome creatures are often referred to as a water baby. Now, what is a water baby? So basically, the water babies were like little gnome type creatures, but they were dealt with by the native tribes in the Central Valley of California, that they would see these water babies and they're straight up evil. There is no like, oh, they're good. Like, oh, well, if you see a good one or you see a bad one. No, every documented sighting that we've seen and researched on these gnome type creatures in California, they're evil, straight up evil. And Tammy's case is one of interest because normally, while the Native Americans are familiar with the concept of a water baby and what these little gnome creatures are, Tammy's not Native American. And she actually, this case happened to her, and she started reaching out to the paranormal community. And that's how we got all her story out. And again, this is a documented case where law enforcement was involved. A lot of different things had happened to this particular property that she was in. So let me go ahead and tell you her story from the start. So the first incident that happens with Tammy is when her and her family, okay, she had several kids, and they moved into the small farmhouse. They thought it was ideal. It was beautiful. It was right near the river. It was kind of in that mid forest range, that kind of Central California is kind of where it's not really pine trees, but it's not really the desert either. And as soon as she got into this property, and it was super cheap, which is if you're anywhere familiar with California, buying a house in California is so expensive. I mean, $500,000 ain't gonna buy you nothing in Los Angeles. But so she was very happy that she found this deal. And there's a reason I always say sometimes is it too good to be true? It might have been like that in this particular case. So as soon as she moves in, she starts having this feeling that she was being watched. And as humans, we have this ability, and I think that we've lost this over time, But there's the old saying of like, I felt the hair crawl in the back of my neck. It's like a spooky feeling, getting goosebumps, getting chills, right? And a lot of people don't know that that sign is it's ingrained into your DNA as a human being from a different time, when it was a prehistoric time where, you know, you were getting hunted by a saber-toothed tiger, or you were going to get killed by a woolly mammoth. That those kind of like times when the humans were around in the ice age, that sixth sense, that warning sense, that's there to protect you. And some people have lost it completely, like they don't trust their gut, and there's a lot of people that are very in tune with it, you know, even to the much point of like an empath. So she had this property, and on the property she had this old barn, and this old barn was kind of like a rickety, falling apart. Now she had different animals on her farm. According to her article, she had like goats, chickens, sheep, small animals. Um, but they would never even go near that little old rickety barn. And she was like, I can never figure out why. It should be nice over there. It's like shaded. You know, you think they would feel safe in a building. And if you've ever had animals, like I grew up spending time on, you know, a farm, and I understand how creatures work. Like they want to be inside, they want to be somewhere safe, they don't want to be exposed out there because there's predators out there. So the fact that they wouldn't go into this old rickety barn just tells you everything you kind of need to know. And unfortunately for Tanny, she's going to find out why that they didn't want to go near it. Now, while this feeling had been going on, she started noticing like weird things happening in her house. Like stuff was moved. That's how it started. Stuff was moved. She had like potted plants, they were kicked over. She had vegetables, they were pulled up. Okay. But it finally, and she just got the feeling that like, well, she would write it off like, oh, it's raccoons. Oh, you know, maybe it's a creature like a dog, stray dog, or a cat. And she would just try to play it off, try to make rational understanding of why this was happening to her little farm there. But what ends up happening is that like one night, her and her son were coming back from getting groceries, and she parked they had a van, and they parked it, and she started noticing movement out of the right, like she was getting the kid out of the car seat, and she looked over on the right, and she grabbed a grocery bag, and then she looked over and saw she heard this like very, and this is her exact words, a very freaky, very evil sounding chuckle, like it's not like a laugh, it's a chuckle. So like that kind of evil chuckle like that. And she looks in the direction where the noise came from, and about 50 yards, that's not that far, she sees a small gnome looking figure, a humanoid type figure. She said it was about 3 feet tall, and she described it as a gnome. And we're talking like a general gnome like you would have in your garden with the hat and everything. But she was very clear about this, and which is interesting because her sighting was documented. She actually went into full detail of what this creature looked like. And so I'm going to read you her description for her. So it was about 3 feet in height, so basically about a yardstick. It had baggy, like black type pants, like a gold colored shirt, and its face was kind of partially covered by like a beard. It had like a salt and pepper beard is what she describes, like a gray and black beard. And then on the head, it had a long kind of pointy hat, like you would think of like a gnome. Have you ever seen like the Travelocity gnome, or like if you're really old school, David the gnome, or Romeo and Juliet, right? And they have those pointy red hats, right? And she said that the nose was very large, and it was kind of bulbous around. The eyes, she said, they were really deep set into the face. How like compared to like a human, the nose is really big, and the eyes are kind of like further back. And it smiled and like gave him like an evil look. And the one thing she noticed is that the grin was super wide, wider than any human could smile. Like think about how wide you get, like if you're like purposely trying to smile really wide with your teeth. He said it was like that, but it was like double the size. It went because like usually when you smile even really wide, your smile's not that big. It's not like even if you show all your teeth, it's not that big. your mouth's not that big. But from the way she described it is when he smiled, this gnome creature smiled at her, it was almost from ear to ear. And the teeth were gross. She said that they were dirty brown, like they'd never been brushed. And then the entire life, they were pointed or jagged. They were like chipped. And it grinned at her like, and she saw that like horrible laugh. And she saw that grin with the pointed teeth. And at that point, she starts screaming. Okay, the fact that it's laughing at her. So she drops the groceries. She rips the kid out the car seat, and then her other two kids run into the house. And that gnome, once it saw her and started laughing, it makes a beeline for her. And she said it moved very fast for its size. Like you would think it would like kind of waddle. She said it moved very fast. And she said she was running as fast as she could. The kids were screaming there. What was that? She said, go to the house, go to the house. They get inside the house. They slam the door shut, right? And at that point, like her son was screaming and crying. The two daughters, the daughters were like, well, what was that? What was that? What was that? And they said the daughters could see, like they were all like locked the door. They closed the curtains and blinds. And what was crazy is the daughters went over and said, go lock the back door. So they went and locked the back door to the patio, to the laundry room. They lock it all. And she said the daughters could say like the way the kitchen curtains were is like you could have like there was like a small curtain, like a half curtain, but you could see over it into the yard. So like you could be washing dishes, right? And you could see the kids playing in the yard. You could see the animals. So the daughters ducked down and they could see the little hat moving back and forth by the window in the kitchen. And they could hear it laughing. And it just kept doing that. And you could hear it pacing. You could hear it pacing and pacing and pacing. And what was crazy was that one of the daughters was really brave. And she tries to peek out like that small little curtain in the kitchen. And she peeked out like just through the crack, and its face was right against the window. And the daughter screamed, and it was like, it laughed, right? And so at that point, the two daughters ran to the mother and the little brother, and they're all like crying hysterically in the kitchen, and they're trying to hold the door. But they could hear him walking back, the gnome creature walking back and forth, back and forth. And they could hear it walking right by the door. Okay. Now, what was crazy was that eventually, this creature eventually left, and she said it felt like an eternity, but it was probably a couple hours. But it was tormenting them. It was the fact that she could hear it walking all along the windows, in front of the door, in front of the kitchen window, and just tormenting them, laughing. And so finally, she was like, what she saw, like it had maybe had gone into back to that barn thing where it was. She went and grabbed the groceries because she's like, I don't want that food to spoil. I need milk for my kids. You know, I need the food to eat. And what was crazy about Tammy is that she never really saw it again. And it was crazy because she actually did call like the police, and the police came out there, and they were like, and she was trying to explain to her, and like the cops looked all around. They went to the barn. They didn't see anything in the barn. But basically the cops were like, you know, I don't know what to tell you. And then but she was dissatisfied with the police. Were like, well, you know, maybe it was a bear. They try to play it off and all sorts of different things. Like maybe it was teenagers. She was like, no, it was like a little old man. He had black pants and a red hat. And so she tried to play it off. The cops tried to play it off. Essentially what Tammy had to do was reach out to the paranormal community. And that's where she started getting more and more research on what this thing was. And she even said that like, she would walk by the barn and she could hear it like, like laughing or taunting her. Like it knew it was there. It knew it had that power on her. Now Tammy moved, and she moved like, I think she moved to Fresno, and she never went back there like, again until much later. She said it was several years later she went back there, and again the house was for sale. But this time around, that barn, that old rickety barn where she thinks that gnome creature lived, was actually knocked down. Now she didn't know if that displaced that gnome, if it had gone back in. She really didn't know what it was. Now, which brings us to what this creature was. Was it a duende? Was it a gnome? Was it one of these water babies that the native tribes in California would talk about? Could be. Now, I'm going to give you a third theory on what maybe one of these creatures could have been, especially this particular case, because of the fact that there was a police report on this case, the fact that, the cops went out there, and it was, again, the cops wrote on the report that, that all the family was visibly shaken. They interviewed all the kids, the little boy, the two sisters, and the mom, all separately, and they all told the same story. And the cops even said, like, it was just very suspicious. I don't know how you could fabricate a story like that in that short of time. Okay. Because like literally she said she called the cops and then eventually she went out there and got the groceries. But she said the way the terror on their faces, I don't know how you could fake that kind of story, because everyone's story completely lined up. And Tammy was to the point where she was like, I'll take a lie detector test on what I saw, this little gnome creature. Now, based on my research, I think that there could have been two different theories, like on this last little part. One, it could have been something called what they called a red cap. Now, if you don't know anything about like English history, this is like English history, but basically these red caps were kind of like a gnome type fairy creature, and they basically lived in like castles that had fell apart, that had been ruined or lost in throughout the time of history, mostly England and Scotland. And if people would try to come into these castles to go exploring, because that's the cool thing to do, like, oh, let's go explore a spooky castle, like your Scooby-Doo. And these red caps would basically murder any traveler, and they were very fearful. And these red caps got their names because what they would do is, how, remember the hat, right? The hat's red. The reason they get that red is that these red caps would dye the hat using the blood from the people that they had killed. But if you look at the actual description of what a red hat is from like old England and Scottish tradition, so going into like the ancient traditions of England and Scotland, these red hats sound exactly like what Tammy had saw. Now, how does a little red hat fairy gnome type creature get to California, to Central California? Now, here's two different theories on how this probably could have happened. Now, you have to remember the United States was a British colony, and a lot of people that came over from like Ireland, Scotland, Great Britain, England at the time, they had that belief of these red hats, these little gnome type creatures out there just killing people. And is it possible that when they brought it here, they manifested it because they believed in it so much? Now, you're like, how could that happen? If you think about it, it'll come true. It's like speaking in something into existence. There's a Tibetan belief, something called the tulpa. Now, this is an interesting concept, and this we'll finish with tonight. A tulpa is where basically it's a group of people. If enough people get behind an idea or idea of a concept of a creature, it can come into existence. Like you think it into existence. And if enough people from that area, from England, had settled in America and they thought of this creature and it came true, it's possible they could have thought it into existence. There's a lot of interesting belief on these tulpa, and we might have to do an episode on the tulpa type creatures, because there is some truth to this belief that you could think something into reality. The other line of thinking is that maybe this thing was conjured, because this is a very specific case. Is this one of the water babies that there was the native tribes had talked about along Porterville, along that river there, the Tule River in California? Possible. Was this something that was a dark entity, channeled through dark magic, that they brought this, like, remember there was a witch that lived in this cottage and she channeled one of these creatures up. There's a lot of thinking into those kind of creatures, that they can be channeled, they can be brought into existence through dark magic. I don't want to get too much into that because it gets really heavy really quick. But we might have to do an episode explaining what, how something like that could happen. I do think that you should, if you are to go, I think that's cool, I should do that. No, I don't think you should even mess with that nonsense. Based on my experience, even the people like, I'm super pro at it. Okay, all right. And it always goes south for these people. It always does. I can give you documented cases of friends that had messed with stuff that they didn't really know with, and they ended up regretting it. Okay, even people are like, oh, well, I'm super in tune with it. You may be, but you might, be messing with stuff you can't explain. And, I think about it like this. It's like fishing. When people when you throw out a line in the ocean, you're hoping to catch a fish. You're hoping to catch this, but you don't know. Maybe a shark bites the line. Maybe something even bigger than the shark bites the line. And you bring it in. That's essentially what you're doing when you're playing around with dark entities and summoning things like a tulpa, that you're throwing a fishing line out to the spirit world. I'm hoping that I get this. And something might come through your portal connection that is not necessarily friendly. So I hope you enjoyed tonight's story. This is the second part of our thing. We will finish out part 3 next week of Mexican folklore. Again, as we always like to say, be safe, be well, and we'll see you on the dark side of the mountain.